Last month, I was sitting in on a high-stakes venture capital pitch. The founder was this 27-year-old guy, sharp as a razor, walking us through complex financial models with the kind of poise you'd expect from a seasoned veteran. On paper, he was the definition of a mature adult. But during the break, I saw something that felt completely, out of place. He got a single notification on his phone, a mildly critical comment on a post he'd made, and I watched his entire demeanor crumble. The executive poise just evaporated, replaced by this visible, vibrating anxiety. He spent the next 20 minutes frantically checking his likes, his face pale, completely unable to focus on the million-dollar deal in front of him. It was a bizarre sight, a man who could navigate global markets but was seemingly defenseless against a digital thumbs down. We built our entire society on the fiction that at 18 or perhaps 21, the human brain is a finished adult unit. We grant the right to vote, to lead, and to accumulate massive debt, assuming the rational actor is finally in the driver's seat. But the neurobiological data tells a much, much stranger story. It turns out we aren't done for a long, long time. Biologically, the human brain is a slow cooker with the critical wiring, the stuff that actually handles impulse control and long-term planning, not reaching a steady state until about age 32. What I saw in that boardroom wasn't a weak person, it was a biological mismatch. It was beta stage hardware, trying to run a high-intensity modern simulation. We've dropped a brain designed for the immediate physical world of the hunter-gatherer into a digital jungle of supernormal stimuli and abstract threats. We call ourselves adults, but for the first 30 years of our lives, we're actually just an ancient animal trying to figure out why its hunting brain is so obsessed with a glowing screen.
That scenario you just laid out, it's just the perfect encapsulation of this whole problem.
Right.
That tension you saw between the expected social performance and that raw, crippling emotional volatility, that's the issue.
That's a huge contradiction.
It is. We define legal adulthood by these arbitrary social markers, 18, 21, whatever it is. But the biological clock of the brain, it just runs so much slower. Mm-hmm. The fact that the most advanced parts of our cognition are still, under construction while we're handing over the keys to the kingdom.
That's the paradox.
That's it, exactly.
And that contradiction is our mission for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We are looking directly at the neurobiological timeline, and we need to move past the common cultural belief, even, the previously held scientific consensus. That brain development just wraps up neatly in our mid-20s.
The old age 25 rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our focus today is on the new structural evidence that places the true plateau, the real stabilization of human brain maturation, much closer to age 32. We're going to examine exactly why our brains take so long to cook, the evolutionary adaptive reasons for this long phase.
And crucially, what happens when that slow-cooking brain meets the modern world?
That's right. What researchers are calling the evolutionary mismatch, the dramatic, often painful collision of our ancient biology with this relentless, hyper-stimulating environment we've built. So let's start with that old consensus. For the longest time, science really did seem to hold that the brain was, for all intents and purposes, complete in the mid-20s.
Oh, absolutely. Age 25 was the milestone.
Especially for the prefrontal cortex, right? If you were 25, you were deemed biologically complete, especially in your executive functions.
And that belief, it wasn't baseless. It came from good science at the time. Earlier structural MRI studies, they consistently showed ongoing development, specifically myelination and synaptic refinement in the PFC through that period.
So it made sense to say, okay, looks like it's wrapping up around here. What changed? What shifted that timeline so dramatically?
It really came down to the scope and the scale of the data. And the technology, of course.
Okay.
Those initial studies were valuable, but they were often limited, smaller sample sizes, less depth in the analysis. The new understanding, it comes from these recent, really large-scale neuroimaging studies using advanced diffusion MRI. DMRI, right. And we are talking about researchers analyzing truly massive data sets. Some of the most influential studies looked at over 4,000 DMRI scans.
4,000 scans?
Yeah.
That's an enormous data set.
It's a game changer, and it covered the entire lifespan from childhood right up to age 90, so you get the whole picture.
What were they looking for specifically with those scans? What did that kind of topological connectivity analysis reveal that earlier studies just couldn't see?
They were looking at the brain's fundamental wiring, its architectural efficiency, what we call topological connectivity.
Okay, so not just what parts are active, but how they're all connected.
Exactly. Think of the brain not just as different regions, like cities, but as a vast interconnected transportation network. The DMRI was mapping how the white matter tracks, the highways connecting those cities, were developing, organizing, and crucially stabilizing over time.
And that's what blew the timeline wide open.
It did,
Oh.
because this analysis identified a critical structural brain development epoch, a window, and that window was from 9 years old right through to 32 years old.
A 23-year span. That is a staggering developmental window.
It is, and that period emerged as the most topologically dynamic period of life.
The most dynamic. So lots of change.
Constant change. It means, contrary to that 25-year consensus, the brain's core infrastructure, its default settings for how different cognitive regions talk to each other, are still actively developing, changing, and reorganizing well into our 30s.
It's a construction zone.
A very active construction zone, not a finished product.
So let me just clarify a key distinction here. The brain isn't just changing adaptively in our 20s and early 30s, which, it does constantly through neuroplasticity.
Right, learning new things.
But it is undergoing fundamental developmental maturation. It's a structural change that's meant to set the final baseline. Is that it?
Precisely. That is the single most important takeaway from this research. The key conclusion is that the structural plateau, what these researchers call steady state connectivity, is reliably reached around age 32.
And what does steady state mean, functionally?
It means that the core infrastructure has achieved its maximal optimized organization and efficiency as designed by our evolutionary history. It's effectively moving out of that dynamic, volatile construction phase of adolescence and young adulthood.
So the initial operating system installation is finally complete.
That's a great way to put it, yes. The OS is installed and stable.
Okay, so let's unpack the core mechanism driving this. It all seems to hinge on the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, and this process called myelination. Let's go deep on this. What is actually happening in the PFC, and why is myelination so critical?
So we often call the prefrontal cortex the brain's CEO. It's the central command center.
Right, for all the complex stuff.
All the hard stuff. Abstract thought, impulse control, working memory, long-term planning, and critically emotional regulation. It's the part of the brain that lets you inhibit that urge for immediate gratification in favor of a much bigger long-term goal.
And the performance of that CEO depends on this myelination process.
Heavily. The speed, the efficiency, the stability of that entire region depends on it.
So for anyone who hasn't thought about this since high school biology, can we get a quick refresher on what myelination actually is?
Absolutely. Think of your brain's nerve fibers, the axons, as extremely long, thin electrical wires.
Okay.
Myelination is the process where glial cells wrap a fatty lipid layer, the myelin sheath, around those axons. This sheath acts exactly like the plastic insulation around a copper wire in your home.
And it does more than just protect it.
Oh, much more. And this is where it gets functionally critical. This insulation doesn't just protect the wire, it dramatically increases the speed of the nerve impulse transmission. Instead of the electrical signal sort of creeping down the axon, the signal literally jumps from gap to gap in the myelin sheath.
That's called saltatory conduction, isn't it?
That's right, saltatory conduction. And it turns a slow, inefficient process into a lightning-fast, highly synchronized one.
And that speed is what you need for higher order thought.
You can't have it without it. You cannot execute complex, regulated thought like delaying a reward for 6 months if the parts of your brain that handle foresight and inhibition aren't talking to each other almost instantly.
So the myelination is what makes that high-level cognition reliable.
Yes. The structural stability it provides is the foundation of reliability.
So if the PFC is still myelinating into our 30s, that means those crucial long-distance connections are literally getting faster, more efficient.
They are, allowing for quicker, more synchronized communication between the parts of the brain that handle regulation, foresight, and all that complex thought. The hardware is being optimized in real time for years longer than we thought.
And the most compelling evidence for this 32-year timeline comes from comparing us to other primates, right?
It does. The truly compelling biological evidence lies in how protracted, how drawn out this myelination process is in humans compared to our closest relatives. This is where the comparative data with chimpanzees becomes so incredibly insightful.
Let's really focus on that chimpanzee contrast because it seems to highlight what is uniquely human about this delay.
Okay. In chimpanzees, the developmental trajectory for what we call myelinated fiber-link density, or MFLD.
Which is basically a measure of how much insulation is in the brain.
A good shorthand, yes. The density of those insulated axons. In chimps, that trajectory is relatively straightforward. Their MFLD reaches adult-like levels right around the time of sexual maturity.
So around 17 years old.
Typically, yes. And crucially, the growth curve for their MFLD is fit by simpler mathematical models, linear or quadratic. which just means the bulk of the myelin development happens rapidly and early, and then it levels off and stabilizes during their adolescence.
And what's their starting point at birth? How myelinated are they when they're born?
Chimpanzee infants are born with about 20% of their maximal adult MFLD in the neocortex.
20%.
And they get to nearly 96% of that max density during adolescence. So they really do hit the ground running. They wrap up that primary construction early, and it coincides very neatly with their reproductive capacity and physical independence.
Okay, so now, contrast that with the human timeline.
It's a completely different story. In humans, neocortical myelination is developmentally protracted. It's stretched out over a vastly longer period. Human infants are born with extremely low MFLD.
How low?
Less than 2% of the maximal adult-like density in the neocortex.
2%. That's incredible.
It is, and it immediately tells you how much of our basic wiring has to be done postnatally, how much depends on interaction with the world.
So we're born much more unfinished.
Far more. After infancy, the rate of myelination slows during childhood and adolescence, but here's the key finding that pushes the timeline past 25. It displays continued pronounced growth well beyond late adolescence and deep into the third decade of life.
So if you compare a 28-year-old brain to a 23-year-old brain, the physical insulation, myelin, is still actively being laid down.
Absolutely. The research showed that MFLD in adults aged 28 or older was significantly greater than in the 11 to 23-year age bracket.
And this is where that different mathematical model comes in.
Right. The developmental trajectory for this process in humans is best fit by a cubic regression function for all the cortical regions they studied.
A cubic function.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds technical, but what does the shape of that curve actually imply for our development? What does it mean in practical terms?
The simpler models for chimps imply a steady, predictable growth that levels off early. The cubic function, however, represents something much more complex.
Which is?
A period of initial rapid growth in infancy, followed by a prolonged, slower intermediate phase, that's adolescence and young adulthood, and then a final sustained growth surge that extends into the late 20s and early 30s before it finally hits that plateau.
So there's a final push late in the game.
A very important final push. This complex, delayed cubic schedule in humans implies that a vastly greater fraction of our postnatal brain expansion and the final wiring of our neural circuits is profoundly influenced by social interactions, complex learning, and environmental demands after we become sexually mature.
So less than 2% at birth and structural growth continuing until 32.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us this huge window of plasticity,
Right.
but it also means we're operating without the full braking system for far longer than we might realize.
And this is where we have to be really clear about the difference between maturation and neuroplasticity.
Right.
Neuroplasticity is the brain's amazing lifelong ability to learn new things, adapt to change, reorganize connections based on experience. You can learn a new language or a musical instrument at any age. That never stops.
So if plasticity is like learning new software, is maturation like upgrading the operating system itself? Making it fundamentally more stable and efficient?
That is an excellent analogy. Maturation is about completing the baseline structural development of the core cognitive regulation systems, the PFC, by reinforcing those white matter connections with myelin. A 25-year-old brain can certainly plan and regulate, but the question is, what does the 30 or 32-year-old brain do better?
What does that extra 7 years of myelination and structural refinement actually buy you, functionally?
Enhanced efficiency and consistency.
Yeah.
A 25-year-old can reason, plan, and regulate impulse in a calm, low-stakes environment, no problem. But the structural stability achieved by 32 allows the individual to do that reliably when faced with acute psychological stress, emotional pressure, high stakes.
Like the $1 million pitch you saw.
Exactly like that. Or even just simple fatigue. The system becomes less volatile, it experiences fewer lapses, and it can maintain consistent performance even when the emotional core, the limbic system, is highly engaged or screaming for attention.
It's the difference between a high-performance engine that runs reliably under stress
and one that stalls out when you push it too hard. The final myelination is what makes the system robust.
It still seems so counterintuitive, though. If maturity brings this enhanced stability and reliability, why would evolution select for a process that leaves us structurally incomplete for the first third of our lives? Why not just speed it up like the chimpanzee does?
Because the delay is not a defect. It is a profound adaptive strategy.
An advantage.
A huge advantage. To understand it, we have to look through the lens of life history theory. The prolonged plasticity and delayed maturation are an evolved adaptive feature, a deliberate strategy that maximized our species' long-term survival and our ability to transmit culture.
And life history theory is basically about how an organism allocates its energy budget throughout its life, right?
Yep.
The trade-off between growing, maintaining, and reproducing.
Exactly. Our species, Homo sapiens, made an enormous bet. We invested in an exceptionally expensive brain.
It uses, what, 20% of our calories?
About that, yes. It's hugely costly. And this high investment necessitated an extended period of dependency and slow growth. As you said earlier, you can choose the fish strategy. Reproduce quickly, mature rapidly, have thousands of offspring.
And hope a few survive.
Or you can choose the elephant strategy, which is the human strategy. Invest intensely in a few offspring, prolong their growth and dependency, and equip them with these complex, powerful, flexible brains that ensure their long-term success.
So we traded rapid independence for late-stage executive power. The slow cook is deliberate.
It is entirely deliberate. The gradual hardening of neural circuits, that protracted myelination extending over 3 decades, allows for the profound integration of complex social learning and cultural context. If our brain structures matured rapidly, like a chimp's, they'd become rigid too soon.
Locking us into behaviors before we'd had a chance to learn.
Locking us in before we had fully absorbed the immense, nuanced complexity of human social structures, language, and all the specialized knowledge we need to survive.
This capacity for absorbing complexity is really where the adaptive value of this extended plasticity shines. We can look at the story of the 28-year-old woman in London who pivoted her career.
Right. She's 28, had a stable career in architecture, and decided to pivot entirely, to move into social psychology.
Which, to her family, probably looked chaotic, like a failure to settle down.
Of course. Because society has this arbitrary expectation that by 25 you should be locked into your life path. But biologically, she wasn't being indecisive.
She was still adaptable.
She was using the prime adaptive advantage of extended neuroplasticity. That wet cement phase of her prefrontal cortex was still accommodating major rewiring. She could absorb the specialized knowledge, the social rules of a new profession in a way that would be far more difficult for a 45-year-old brain.
Her brain was prioritizing learning over being locked in.
It was prioritizing continued high-level social and specialized learning over premature, rigid specialization. This ability to make massive, late-stage learning shifts is a signature of human cognition.
And it's not just about adding the myelin insulation. It's also about synaptic pruning, correct? Getting rid of unused connections.
Absolutely. Synaptic pruning is the other side of the coin. It's the process where the brain eliminates neural connections that are unused or redundant. It refines the circuits, making the whole network more efficient.
Like cleaning up the wiring.
And research has shown that this refinement process also continues in the human prefrontal cortex until as late as age 30. So the brain is doing 2 things at once.
It's adding insulation through myelination.
And it's actively editing and refining the network layout through pruning based on real-world cultural feedback right up to that 30 to 32 age range.
So the brain literally stays open for business to gather the maximum amount of cultural and social data possible before it settles on its final adult configuration.
That's it. This biological openness gives us this decade of grace to absorb cultural complexity and specialized knowledge, which is essential for thriving in the uniquely complex human world.
Okay, let's pivot to another critical element of being a young adult. High-stakes risk-taking. If the PFC is the brake system and it's still being tuned, why would evolution leave the engine, the impulse and reward system running so hot? Why tolerate all that volatility?
That's where we move from the advantage of being a slow learner to the advantage of being an aggressive explorer. The tolerance for risk in young adulthood can be understood through something called error management theory, or EMT.
And this is all calibrated for our ancestral environment, the EEA.
Right. Calibrated for the environment of evolutionary adaptedness.
So give us the simple breakdown of EMT.
EMT suggests that our brains evolved cognitive biases that are designed to minimize the cost of the most dangerous error in an uncertain situation. In the unpredictable EEA, especially for young adults, decisions often involved huge uncertainty about resources, status, or mating opportunities.
And there are 2 ways to be wrong.
2 ways. You can have a false positive, you take a risk and it fails. Or you can have a false negative, you play it safe and you miss out on a massive opportunity.
And what was the greater evolutionary cost for a young person back then?
For a young adult, especially a male trying to establish status and attract mates, the cost of a false negative.
Missing out.
Missing out on a high-stakes, status-enhancing opportunity like discovering a new hunting ground or winning a conflict, that cost was often significantly greater in reproductive terms, than the cost of a failed, non-lethal attempt.
So better to try and fail than to not try at all.
From an evolutionary perspective, yes. So evolution biased us toward sensation-seeking and high-risk exploration. The reward pathways fire fiercely in response to novelty and potential status gain, nudging the young adult to test boundaries and push the envelope.
The group needed scouts.
Precisely. The group needed scouts to explore territories, find new resources, and establish social hierarchies. And the young adult brain, with its still maturing PFC brakes and its hyper-responsive limbic accelerator, is biologically built to be that explorer.
And we can see this exact risk profile in the story of the 26-year-old entrepreneur who sank his life savings into that high-risk tech startup.
Yes, the one his mentors called a suicidal gamble. In our modern, financialized world, that decision looks utterly reckless. But if you view it through that EMT lens, his brain was just performing an ancient risk calculation.
He was biased toward the big win.
He was biased toward believing the reward, the huge status and impact of founding a successful company, was worth the colossal financial risk. The biological imperative to achieve high status felt much more important than the short-term cost of failure.
And the adaptive nature of this phase is also seen in how he coped with the failure.
That's the strategic investment part. The young adult brain is built to test boundaries and absorb the results. When he failed, he acquired this immense library of complex, lived experience, networking skills, and resilience that playing it safe could never have taught him.
So the volatility isn't a bug, it's a feature.
It's a strategic biological investment in future stability and complex decision-making. You're trading early mistakes for late-stage mastery. By the time that structural stability arrives around age 32, the individual is armed with a wealth of real-world data, refined in the fires of youthful exploration.
Okay, so we've established that this 32-year timeline is a feature, an adaptive strategy for learning and exploration in our ancestral past. But this perfect biological blueprint now exists in a world it was never designed for. This collision, the evolutionary mismatch, is where these amazing biological features start creating widespread dysfunction.
The mismatch is the core of the problem. You have a brain that was optimized for immediate physical dangers and tangible rewards.
In a small tribe.
In a small tribe, in the physical world. And it's now operating in a reality defined by abstraction. Abstract threats like student debt, abstract rewards like Instagram likes, and abstract competition on a global scale.
So we're running outdated software on beta stage hardware.
That's it exactly. EEA-calibrated drives running on a still maturing prefrontal cortex. And this mismatch means that the natural drives that were once beneficial, like intense focus on status or craving calories, are now easily hijacked.
And this hijacking is driven by what are called supernormal stimuli?
Right. These are hyper-concentrated, engineered, artificial versions of natural rewards that are incredibly effective at hijacking the still-maturing limbic reward system.
They're too good to resist.
They exploit the intensity of the reward circuit. They offer 1,000 times the potency of the natural reward our brain evolved to seek.
Let's use the story of Leo, the young man in Seoul, who was trapped in that cycle of doom scrolling and high-risk trading. His situation seems to perfectly illustrate this.
It does. Leo's struggle, which society often simplifies as a lack of discipline or willpower, is actually a biological vulnerability being exposed. His brain, still structurally developing that executive control, the myelination is still ongoing, is fundamentally outmatched by algorithms.
Algorithms designed by engineers to exploit those exact pathways.
Explicitly designed to exploit the dopamine and novelty-seeking pathways. The fully myelinated PFC is supposed to act as the braking system. Without it operating at peak efficiency until 32, impulsivity and addiction in scenarios like Leo's are less a moral failing.
And more predictable biological vulnerability.
A vulnerability to engineered stimuli that were never supposed to exist. We are asking 24-year-olds to resist things like hyper-concentrated pornography, algorithmic gambling, or endless social feeds.
That their hardware isn't equipped to regulate reliably.
Not for another 8 years, no. The system is designed to seek novelty and risk, and the modern world has built perfectly optimized, incredibly potent traps for those ancient drives.
And beyond the digital dopamine traps, there's just the sheer scale of the social environment that contributes to this mismatch.
Yes, human social cognition evolved to manage groups limited by what we call Dunbar's number.
Which is around 150 people.
Roughly 150 stable, meaningful relationships. Our emotional and regulatory modules are calibrated for that level of complexity, where social threats were immediate, tangible, and came from within a small, defined tribe.
But today, Young adults are exposed to judgment, comparison, and potential social rejection from thousands, sometimes millions of people online.
And this creates an overwhelming, continuous evaluative pressure. The constant awareness of thousands of potential judges just overloads the still developing regulatory modules. This barrage of abstract social threats contributes significantly to the rise in chronic anxiety and emotional dysregulation in young adults.
Their prefrontal smoke detector is going off all the time.
It is. It was calibrated for managing status in a small tribe, and now it's being continuously triggered by abstract digital threats it was never designed to process at this volume or scale. The sheer load overwhelms the system before it's fully optimized.
And if we look at the consequences of this mismatch when it comes to early substance use, the stakes become profoundly high during this dynamic developmental period.
The risks are disproportionate. The research is very clear that early substance abuse, nicotine, alcohol, cannabis, interferes directly with these critical maturation stages.
It messes with the construction process.
It does. It interferes with the active myelination and pruning that's happening. These substances can permanently alter the brain's developmental trajectory, particularly in the reward circuits and inhibitory control pathways.
And the effect is worse before 32.
Much worse. Because the core structural development is still underway, the interference is amplified. It can fundamentally change the final architectural configuration of the executive control system for life.
Okay, so we've covered the structural science, the evolutionary why, and the painful reality of the mismatch. Let's pull these threads together. The core conflict in our society seems to be this clash between the societal fiction of instant adulthood and the biological reality of this long, protracted development.
That's the heart of it. The cultural demand for a finished product, an emotionally regulated, long-term planning, financially responsible citizen at 18 or 21, it just stands in stark contrast to the scientific evidence.
The evidence that shows the essential hardware calibration is still in progress for another decade or more.
We're socially treating a system as stable and complete when biologically it's still highly dynamic and vulnerable.
And that contrast often creates a misunderstanding of research, doesn't it? It leads to this debate where the science gets flattened into a simple excuse.
Yes, that my brain isn't done yet defense.
Right. People argue that talking about a 32-year timeline leads to this unhelpful infantilization, where young adults just abdicate responsibility for their actions.
And that is the nuance we absolutely must protect. The goal of understanding this biology is not to pathologize this developmental stage or provide an excuse for harmful behavior. All individuals, regardless of age, must be held accountable for their choices.
So what is the goal then?
The goal is to introduce neuroempathy and context into how we structure our world and how we judge young adults.
So understanding that high volatility and impulsive choices are just statistically more likely and fundamentally biological, when the cognitive control systems are still tuning for efficiency. That's not an excuse. It's just a necessary piece of information.
It shifts the focus from moral failure to developmental context. The legal line in the sand 18 or 21 is arbitrary. It shifts across cultures and across history. But the biological line in the sand, that consistent structural efficiency achieved around 32, that's a constant that we ignore at our own peril.
It should help us design better support systems.
Better structures, better educational curricula, more realistic expectations. It helps us understand that young adulthood is, by evolutionary design, a period of intense, volatile learning and exploration, not quiet stability.
And we have to circle back to the reason for this whole delay. If the prolonged development is the source of all this modern trouble, we have to remember that that very same delay is precisely what grants us our unique cognitive powers.
Absolutely. Our exceptional human cognition arises because of this extended developmental schedule, not in spite of it. Researchers spent decades trying to find the one single trait that makes humans so smart. Is it language? Is it tool use? Theory of mind?
A magic bullet theory.
And the consensus has moved away from that. We now understand that our superior cognitive performance isn't due to one unique trait, but to the intricate interactions and reinforcement between multiple cognitive domains.
So social cognition, planning, language, they all build on each other.
They do, over developmental time. And the extended plasticity, stretching all the way to 32, is the essential scaffolding that allows those complex abstract interactions to fully mature, integrate, and stabilize.
It's the biological precondition.
It is. It's what allows for the profound integration necessary to achieve truly complex language, full-fledged theory of mind, and the systematic abstract reasoning that defines our species. We traded rapid completion for supreme interconnected complexity and adaptability.
It's astonishing when you zoom out. We spend the first third of our lives building the scaffolding for the most complex known structure in the universe.
And that really brings us to the final provocative thought this deep dive uncovers. The age of 32 is not some magical age of sudden wisdom.
Yeah.
It represents the completion of the human brain's fundamental design specification. It's the point at which the prefrontal cortex, our ultimate biological brake system, the seat of reliable executive control, has finally developed its full complement of myelinated connections.
So what does recognizing that timeline really mean for us?
It means moving away from the fiction of instant adulthood. It means embracing the reality that for the first 30-odd years of our lives, we are all ancient animals navigating a vastly complex, supernormal world with hardware that is still strategically calibrating itself for maximum future complexity.
We are, by design, slow cookers.
And the modern world is turning up the heat far too high, far too soon.